It was a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles. Nothing extraordinary was expected from this flight. The passengers settled into their seats, some already dozing off. While others flipped through in-flight magazines, the crew prepared for a smooth journey as the captain made his announcements, and the flight attendants began their usual rounds among the aisles. One flight attendant, in particular, stood out, known for her radiant smile and bubbly personality. She moved through the cabin with ease, making small talk with passengers and offering drinks. She had a way of making even the most mundane part of the flight seem a little brighter, but on this particular flight, something would happen that would change everything. As the flight progressed, the cabin lights dimmed, and the usual hum of the engines filled the air. Passengers relaxed into their seats, some watching movies, others scrolling through their phones. It was during this time that a group of passengers near the back of the plane began to interact with the flight attendant. They had struck up a conversation, and she had joined them in a casual chat, laughing along with their jokes and comments. What seemed like a harmless moment quickly turned into something more as the flight attendant was seen sipping from a bottle of what appeared to be alcohol. The passengers in the group were casually drinking too, none of them seeming concerned about the regulations that governed what was allowed on the plane. A few minutes into the exchange, one passenger took out their phone and began recording the scene. It started as a way to capture the light-hearted atmosphere of the moment, but things quickly took a different turn. The video showed the flight attendant laughing freely with the passengers, her behavior becoming increasingly less professional as the minutes ticked by. She had slipped from the role of an employee bound by regulations to someone who was engaging with passengers as though they were old friends, no longer worrying about the responsibilities she had. As a member of the crew, her actions were carefree and reckless, in stark contrast to the strict guidelines every airline employee was expected to follow. The passenger who had filmed the interaction felt a growing sense of discomfort. The flight attendant was supposed to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone on board, not engage in this kind of behavior. The realization began to sink in that what had been captured might not just be an innocent moment. The video was posted online within hours of the flight landing, and almost immediately it began to spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The footage quickly gained traction and was shared by thousands. The caption on the post was simple yet provocative: "Flight attendant gone wild on a flight." The video was everywhere. People were talking about it in the comment sections of news outlets and social media feeds. The scene was becoming something of an internet sensation. The public reaction was swift and intense. Some people found the situation amusing, others were horrified. They couldn't believe that a flight attendant would act so irresponsibly during a flight. The debate began almost instantly. Was it just a fun moment, or a blatant violation of safety protocols and regulations? The airline was now in a difficult position. Faced with the pressure of responding to the growing controversy, they issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising to investigate the matter internally, but that didn't seem to satisfy the outraged public, who demanded to know more about how this could have happened. How had an employee been allowed to drink alcohol while on duty? How had they been allowed to act in such an unprofessional manner? Questions flooded in from news outlets, from concerned passengers, and from social media users, all eager to know the full story. The story seemed like it would fade away after a few days, but instead it was only gaining momentum. People wanted answers, and they wanted them quickly. The flight attendant became the center of attention, and though her name had yet to be revealed, the pressure on the airline was building with every passing minute. People were wondering what would happen next. Would she face severe consequences, or would this be brushed aside as a minor issue in the grand scheme of things? The public wasn't sure, but they were ready for whatever came next. As the video continued to circulate, the public's reaction became even more intense. What had started as a small incident had grown into a full-blown scandal, and now everyone was waiting for the airline to make a move. But the company remained silent. The longer they waited, the louder the voices became. Some passengers who had been on the flight began to share their own experiences and observations, further fueling the growing fire. One passenger claimed that the flight attendant had seemed visibly intoxicated. By the end of the flight, another stated that the flight attendant had been laughing so hard with the group that she had even forgotten to make her rounds to check on other passengers. Concerns about safety grew louder as people began to question whether anyone had noticed their behavior in real time. Behind the scenes, the airline was scrambling to get ahead of the scandal. They had already launched an internal investigation into the flight attendants' actions, but the public wasn't satisfied with vague statements and promises of inquiries. They wanted something concrete. They wanted a resolution. And they wanted it now. The media picked up the story quickly. It was the kind of sensational tale that everyone wanted to talk about. The once respected flight attendant was now the subject of constant headlines. Some news outlets called her actions reckless, others deemed them downright dangerous to the public. But the true story was only just beginning to unfold. A day after the video had gone viral, more footage surfaced, showing the flight attendant in a similar scenario on a different flight. Several months earlier, this time the video was even more damning. It showed the same flight attendant engaging in another conversation with a group of passengers. But this time she was seen standing in the galley, openly drinking alcohol from a cup. It was clear she had broken protocol once again. And this time the footage was even clearer. The passengers in the video appeared to be egging her on, and she was laughing along, oblivious to the fact that the situation was being recorded by another passenger watching from the back of the cabin. The new video was shared just as rapidly as the first one, and it sent the internet into another frenzy. The scandal had now reached new heights, and the question on everyone's mind was whether or not this was an isolated issue, or if it was part of a larger pattern of behavior. The flight attendant's actions seemed to indicate a history of poor judgment. But why had she acted this way? Was she simply overwhelmed by the demands of her job? Or was there something more to it? Rumors began to spread, suggesting that the flight attendant had been under a great deal of personal stress in recent months. Some sources claimed she had been facing financial difficulties, while others suggested her behavior could have been the result of long hours and exhaustion. Whatever the reason, her actions were now under intense scrutiny, and no one could look away. As the investigation into the flight attendant's conduct continued, the media kept the story in the public eye, and more passengers came forward to share their experiences. One passenger spoke about how the flight attendant had seemed distant and distracted earlier in the flight, before she suddenly loosened up with the group of passengers. The contrast in her behavior was striking and unsettling to those who had been around her before, and after the incident, the revelation that the flight attendant had been drinking wasn't the only concern. Passengers were starting to voice their unease about the potential risks involved with her actions. Did she really know how to handle an emergency situation? If one had occurred during the flight, could her behavior have put everyone on board in jeopardy? The airline's statement was vague and offered few details, other than confirming that an internal investigation was underway, but that did little to satisfy the growing number of concerned passengers and the public at large. They wanted answers, and they wanted accountability. It was clear that the flight attendant's actions had sparked a debate over airline safety protocols and what was acceptable behavior for crew members, while on-duty people began to demand stricter rules and clearer boundaries for flight attendants who had such an important role in maintaining safety aboard planes. But the controversy was far from over, as the flight attendant's fate hung in the balance. As the media frenzy surrounding the flight attendant's actions intensified, so did the public's demands for answers. The video had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the airline industry. In the eyes of many people, it wasn't just about a single employee's behavior. It was about the larger issues of accountability and responsibility. Some commentators argued that the flight attendant was simply a victim of a broken system that placed too many pressures on its workers. Others believed that her actions were a clear sign of a lack of professionalism within the industry. A few days after the second video went viral, the airline was forced to release a more detailed statement. They confirmed that the flight attendant in question had been removed from active duty, pending the results of an internal investigation. But the damage had already been done. The public was no longer content with vague promises. They wanted immediate consequences. While the airline worked behind the scenes to determine the flight attendant's fate, the public was busy dissecting every part of her past. They scoured her social media profiles, looking for clues as to what might have led to such behavior. And what they found only seemed to complicate the story. Further pictures surfaced, showing the flight attendant in casual settings with friends, where she appeared to be partying and drinking. In one photo, she was holding a drink in her hand with a group of friends at a bar. Others showed her enjoying vacations, where she was seen laughing and clearly letting loose. It was all perfectly innocent on the surface, but when viewed through the lens of her recent actions, it began to raise questions. Was this a person who simply had an occasional drink with friends? Or was there something deeper at play? Some speculated that the flight attendant had been struggling with her personal life, but there were no clear answers, yet just more rumors and assumptions circulating at a rapid pace. The airline's internal investigation began to take shape, and many assumed it would end with a straightforward conclusion. She would likely be fired for violating safety protocols and unprofessional conduct. But as the investigation went on, it became clear that things weren't as simple as they appeared. Behind closed doors, the airline's management began to face pressure from both sides. Some wanted the flight attendant fired immediately, while others pushed for a more lenient approach. Some even suggested that her actions could be a symptom of larger systemic issues within the airline industry. Many began to point fingers at the airline itself for not providing enough support for their employees. One former flight attendant who had worked for the airline for years spoke out, saying that the pressure put on flight attendants was often overwhelming, and that long hours and strict regulations could drive even the most professional employees to snap. While the investigation was ongoing, the flight attendant's story continued to captivate the public imagination, and the questions kept piling up. How had she gone from a respected employee to the center of a viral scandal? What had driven her to behave this way? Was she really just a victim of circumstance? Or had she let the power of social media and her newfound fame get to her head? Meanwhile, the video continued to circulate, with new edits and remixes being shared across social platforms, and the online debate showed no signs of slowing down. Some believed that the scandal was being blown out of proportion, while others felt that the flight attendant had broken a sacred trust with passengers, and her actions could not be forgiven so easily. The video had sparked a conversation about responsibility, professionalism, and the consequences of modern-day fame, but no one seemed to have the definitive answer. Everyone had their own opinion, and it felt like the story would never truly be over. The airline, facing increasing pressure, finally made a public announcement regarding the status of their investigation, but they gave no clear indication of how they planned to handle the flight attendant's future. They assured the public that the matter was being taken seriously, but the lack of a decisive statement only added to the growing frustration. The public was tired of waiting. They wanted closure. They wanted justice. They wanted to know that accountability would be served. But for now, the case remained unresolved. As the investigation into the flight attendant's behavior continued, the public's patience began to wear thin. They had already seen the videos, they had read the reports, and they had formed their opinions. Now they were demanding answers. The silence from the airline was growing louder and louder as each day passed with no official resolution in sight. The pressure on the company was mounting from all sides. Some passengers had started a petition calling for the flight attendant to be permanently fired, while others argued that the incident had been blown out of proportion. and that she deserved a second chance. But regardless of where people stood on the issue, one thing was clear: the story had taken on a life of its own, and the airline seemed to be struggling to keep up. Behind the scenes, the airline was deep into its investigation, but it seemed like every time they thought they had a clear picture, more details emerged that made things more complicated. One former colleague of the flight attendant came forward and claimed that the flight attendant had been experiencing a great deal of personal stress in the months leading up to the incident. According to this source, the flight attendant had been dealing with a difficult breakup and had been working overtime to make ends meet. This new information raised questions about whether her behavior was a result of personal turmoil or if it was simply a lapse in judgment. Some began to wonder if her actions were a cry for help rather than a sign of professional misconduct. Despite this new information, the public's reaction remained divided. Some felt sympathy for her and believed that she had been pushed to the breaking point, while others dismissed the idea of personal problems as an excuse for such unprofessional behavior. To make matters worse, a third video surfaced, showing the flight attendant acting similarly on yet another flight. This time, she was seen chatting with passengers and drinking alcohol from a hidden cup in the galley. Once again, the behavior was far from what was expected of a flight attendant. And once again, the video went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. This third video seemed to confirm the suspicions of those who had already labeled her as reckless and irresponsible. It felt as if every new piece of evidence only made her case worse and worse. The airline, already under intense scrutiny, found itself in a difficult position. They had already been criticized for not acting quickly enough, and now they were faced with even more damning footage. The question on everyone's mind was whether the flight attendant would be fired or whether the airline would choose to offer her a second chance. But no one had an answer yet. As the investigation dragged on and the public debate raged, the media continued to fuel the fire with every new detail they uncovered. Some outlets began to question whether the airline was handling the situation properly, with one news segment asking if the company had been covering up a larger issue of employee misconduct. Some critics argued that this wasn't just about a single flight attendant's behavior, but about a larger culture of neglect and disregard for safety protocols within the airline industry. The pressure on the airline was now at an all-time high, and with each passing day, the stakes only seemed to get higher. The flight attendant's name had become synonymous with the scandal, and the public was obsessed with her every move. Every new piece of information seemed to send shockwaves through the media and social networks. The debate about what should happen next was everywhere. Some believed that her actions were unforgivable and that she should face severe consequences, while others argued that it was time to stop treating her like a criminal and start looking at the systemic issues that had led to this point. In the midst of all this chaos, the flight attendant herself remained silent. She had not made any public statements since the videos first surfaced, and her whereabouts were unknown. Some speculated that she was hiding out and waiting for the storm to pass. Others believed that she was simply overwhelmed by the situation and unsure of how to respond. Whatever the case, her absence only added to the sense of mystery surrounding the entire situation. And the longer she stayed out of the public eye, the more the media and public would speculate about what she was really thinking, what was going on behind the scenes, and what would happen next. As the days turned into weeks, the silence from the airline and the flight attendant only seemed to intensify. The public's frustration had reached a boiling point. Every social media platform was flooded with posts from angry passengers, critics, and even employees from within the airline industry. Some demanded that the flight attendant be publicly shamed, while others felt that the company was being too harsh on her. There were even those who began questioning if the airline was actively trying to cover up a deeper issue. Their accusations grew louder each day, and they pointed to the long history of staff complaints about the working conditions as a possible root cause of this entire incident. The speculation became more dramatic with each passing moment, and the media was all too happy to keep feeding the fire. Every new revelation seemed to add fuel to the growing inferno. The airline finally decided to hold a press conference to address the mounting public pressure. It had become clear that they could no longer avoid the issue. It was a make-or-break moment for the company. As the executives sat in front of the cameras, they tried to maintain an air of calm. But the tension in the room was palpable. They acknowledged the flight attendants' actions and reassured the public that an extensive investigation was underway. But the questions kept coming. Why had it taken so long to act? Why had the airline allowed this behavior to continue for so long? Had there been similar incidents in the past? Why wasn't anyone being held accountable? The executives stumbled over their words, trying to offer explanations for their delayed response. But it was clear that no matter what they said, the damage had already been done. The public was no longer buying what they were selling. As the press conference came to a close, the outrage only grew louder. People across the country began calling for a boycott of the airline. Some passengers shared their stories about poor service and safety concerns during flights, and began to ask how many other flight attendants were behaving the same way behind closed doors. Many felt betrayed, not just by the flight attendant, but by the airline itself, for failing to keep their employees in check and protect the passengers who trusted them with their safety. The scandal had revealed deeper cracks in the system, and now it seemed as though no one could escape the fallout. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's name was everywhere. Her story had transcended the scandal itself and turned into something bigger. She was now the symbol of a larger conversation about the pressures faced by flight attendants and the harsh expectations placed upon them every day. Some of her supporters began to speak out, saying that she was a victim of a toxic work culture and that the airline had failed to offer the support and resources she needed. Others pointed to the long hours and grueling schedules that often led to emotional and physical exhaustion. They argued that her actions might have been a cry for help, and that the airline had a responsibility to ensure the well-being of its employees. It was a narrative that seemed to resonate with some, but for many it felt like a justification of bad behavior and a way to excuse the flight attendant's lack of professionalism. As the debate raged on, the flight attendant remained silent. Her social media accounts had been scrubbed, and there were no official statements from her or her legal team. Some believed that she was waiting for the storm to pass, while others wondered if she was simply trying to escape the intense scrutiny surrounding her every move. There was no denying that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. When she first stepped onto that flight, everything had seemed normal. Then suddenly it all unraveled in front of her eyes. Her name had become synonymous with scandal, and she couldn't escape it no matter how hard she tried. The focus now shifted to what the airline would do next. Would they fire her or offer her a second chance? Would they take action against other employees to show they were committed to addressing the deeper issues? Or would they let the matter fade away and hope that the public would eventually move on whatever happened next? It was clear that the aftermath of the scandal would be felt for a long time, and no one involved would be able to walk away unscathed. The ripples from this story would continue to affect not just the flight attendant, but everyone who was touched by it. As the public outcry continued to grow, it became clear that this scandal was no longer just about one flight attendant's actions. It had become a symbol of the broader issues within the airline industry. The debate shifted from her personal misconduct to the culture that allowed such behavior to take place. Many began questioning whether the airline's internal culture had played a role in her actions. Had the company created an environment where employees felt overworked and undervalued? Was the pressure to maintain perfection on every flight so great that it led some workers to act out in ways they normally wouldn't? The conversation soon turned into a larger conversation about employee well-being and the mental and emotional toll that comes with working in such a high-stress environment. The pressure mounted as critics of the airline began to argue that the company had failed not just in protecting passengers, but also in supporting its staff. Behind the scenes, the airline executives were scrambling to manage the fallout and make difficult decisions about how to handle the flight attendants' future. They knew they couldn't avoid addressing the issue any longer, but each step they took seemed to add fuel to the fire. First, they suspended her pending further investigation. Then they were pressured to release a more detailed statement, offering an apology to their customers and employees. But nothing seemed to satisfy the public. They were still waiting for real consequences, and many feared that the company was simply trying to cover up the cracks in its system by focusing all the attention on one individual. The flight attendant became the face of a much larger problem within the company, and some passengers began to argue that firing her would be nothing more than a way to deflect attention from the real issue. As the weeks passed, more stories began to emerge. Some flight attendants from other airlines came forward to share their experiences and reveal the struggles they faced on a daily basis. One former employee spoke about the pressure to meet performance quotas and the long hours that left many workers exhausted and mentally drained. Another described the emotional toll of constantly dealing with rude or demanding passengers and the lack of support from their employers in dealing with the fallout of difficult situations. Others spoke about how they felt forced to push through their own personal struggles and put on a happy face for passengers, regardless of how they were feeling inside. These stories resonated with many people and fueled the belief that the flight attendants' behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger systemic problem, one that needed to be addressed in order to prevent more incidents like this from happening in the future. At the same time, some passengers began to speak out in support of the flight attendant. Many argued that her actions were a result of the difficult conditions she had been working under, and that she had been unfairly vilified. They pointed out that she had been the one to take on the burden of the job day in and day out while facing a stressful environment that had ultimately led to a breakdown in her professional behavior. Others questioned whether the airline had ever truly cared about its employees and suggested that they were more focused on protecting their own reputation than ensuring the well-being of their staff. The public's divided opinion on the matter only fueled the tension, and as the investigation dragged on, it became increasingly clear that no matter what the final outcome was, the story had exposed something much deeper than a simple lapse in judgment. Meanwhile, the flight attendant continued to remain silent. She had not spoken publicly since the initial incident, and her absence from the media only added to the sense of mystery surrounding her actions. Some speculated that she was laying low until the media storm passed, while others believed that she was simply too overwhelmed to make a statement. Whatever the case, it was clear that the situation had taken a toll on her, and she was no longer the confident and smiling employee that people had once admired. Her silence created more questions than answers, and as the public waited for her to speak, or for the airline to make a decision, the story began to shift from the scandal itself to the uncertainty surrounding what would happen next. The airline was now facing mounting pressure to act decisively, but it wasn't just the flight attendant's future at stake. It was the future of the company itself and its reputation as a leader in the industry. Whatever decision they made would have long-lasting consequences, and no matter what direction they took, it was clear that the fallout from this scandal would continue to ripple throughout the company and the airline industry as a whole. As the days continued to stretch into weeks, the flight attendant's case became even more of a focal point, not just for the airline, but for the entire industry. Debates raged across news outlets and social media, with passionate arguments both for and against her actions. Those who believed in her innocence argued that the airline industry itself was to blame for creating an environment where employees were pushed beyond their limits. They pointed out that long hours, limited breaks, and constant pressure to maintain a perfect public image were all contributing factors that led to her behavior. They claimed that the flight attendant's actions were symptomatic of a larger problem that needed to be addressed, one that was deeply rooted in the airline's corporate culture. Others, however, took a much harsher stance and argued that regardless of external pressures, her actions were inexcusable, and that such behavior was a direct violation of the trust passengers placed in her and the airline itself. These opposing views created an even more polarized environment, and the public found itself more divided than ever on what should happen next. Behind closed doors, the airline was making decisions and weighing its options. The internal investigation had reached its conclusion, and the executives knew that their next move would be crucial. They had already been under intense scrutiny, and they couldn't afford another misstep. They were faced with the uncomfortable reality that no matter what they did, they would be criticized by someone. On one hand, they could choose to fire the flight attendant in an effort to demonstrate that they took the situation seriously and upheld their safety standards. On the other hand, they could offer her a second chance and risk alienating the public who wanted to see accountability upheld. Whatever path they chose would be scrutinized heavily, and the pressure to make the right decision was enormous. As the final decision loomed, the flight attendant remained in the spotlight. Her name was on the lips of every media outlet, and her actions had sparked a wider conversation about the demands of the airline industry. Many wondered what would happen if she were allowed to return to work. Would her reputation ever recover? Could she continue to perform the duties of a flight attendant with the same level of trust and professionalism? Or would passengers always remember her for the scandal that had unfolded? Many of her colleagues within the airline industry watched the situation closely. Some felt sympathy for her, while others were unsure how to approach the situation in the wake of the scandal. Would they be expected to follow her example? Would they be held to the same standard of accountability for their own actions? The ripple effects were widespread, and even those not directly involved with the case were left to question how the system might be failing its employees. Finally, the airline made its decision after weeks of mounting pressure and speculation. They announced that the flight attendant would be terminated from her position. The company stated that they had considered all factors in their decision, but that ultimately they had to prioritize the safety and trust of their passengers. While the airline executives expressed regret over how the situation had unfolded, they made it clear that they believed this was the right course of action, and that they would be implementing new measures to ensure that similar incidents did not occur in the future. The announcement was met with a mixed response. Many felt that the airline had done the right thing by holding the flight attendant accountable. Others, however, felt that the decision was too harsh and that it ignored the deeper issues at play within the industry. As the dust began to settle from the airline's announcement, the flight attendant disappeared from the public eye. She had not issued any statement following her termination, and her silence only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Her social media profiles remained locked, and no one knew where she had gone or what she planned to do next. The public's interest in her story began to wane, but the conversation about the systemic issues within the airline industry continued to grow louder. People began to demand more substantial changes to the working conditions of flight attendants and other airline employees. They called for better mental health support, better training programs, and more realistic expectations from the companies they worked for. The flight attendants' case had become a symbol of something much larger than one person's actions. It had sparked a movement that could change the way the industry operated for years to come. But whether that change would come soon enough was still uncertain. As the final chapter of the flight attendant's story began to unfold, her sudden disappearance from the public eye did not stop the conversations that continued to swirl around her case. The airline had made its decision, and while it hoped that firing her would put an end to the scandal, the reality was far more complex. As people continued to discuss the issue, the focus shifted from her to the broader implications of the incident. and what needed to be done to prevent something like this from happening again. Many felt that the airline had not done enough to address the root causes of the problem, and that by focusing on one employee, they had missed the larger systemic issues that were at play. Some experts in the field of aviation and employee welfare began to speak out, calling for an overhaul of the way the airline industry treated its workers. They pointed to the increasing pressures that flight attendants faced and the toll it took on their mental health and well-being. The conversation became a rallying cry for reform and change in the airline industry. Workers began to demand better working conditions, longer breaks, more reasonable hours, and better support systems to handle the emotional and mental strain of the job. These conversations were not limited to the flight attendants, but extended to all employees within the industry, ground staff, pilots, and other airline workers who faced similar pressures. In an effort to create a safer and more sustainable working environment, the conversation quickly became a movement that sought to hold airlines accountable for their treatment of employees and to prioritize the well-being of the people who kept the planes in the air and ensured the safety of their passengers. While the public's attention on the flight attendant gradually faded as new scandals and news stories took over, the momentum for change continued to grow. The public became increasingly aware of the challenges that airline workers faced and the unfair expectations placed on them. Many who had previously defended the flight attendant began to shift their stance and agreed that changes were necessary. They recognized that her actions, though unprofessional, were perhaps indicative of a much deeper issue that had been ignored for far too long, and they were ready to advocate for the systemic changes that were needed. Meanwhile, the flight attendant herself remained out of the spotlight. Despite the public's demand for her to speak out, she did not reappear, and there was no indication as to what had happened to her. After her firing, some speculated that she had moved to a new city in an effort to escape the constant attention, while others believed that she was reflecting on her actions in private, perhaps attempting to regain control of her life after everything had unraveled so quickly. Her absence left more questions than answers. But as time passed, the story of her scandal began to fade from the headlines. The media moved on to the next big story, and the attention shifted elsewhere. But the questions that had been raised by her actions remained unanswered in the minds of many. As the months passed, it became clear that the scandal had left a permanent mark on the airline industry. The pressure for reform only grew stronger, and more voices within the industry began to speak out against the toxic work culture that had allowed this incident to happen in the first place. It wasn't just the flight attendant's actions that needed to be addressed. It was the environment that had allowed her behavior to flourish, and the industry was slowly beginning to wake up to that reality. The flight attendant's case became a lesson for many. It was a reminder that the pressure placed on workers in high-stress industries could lead to dangerous consequences if left unchecked. Her story became a symbol for those advocating for better treatment of airline employees and the need for change within the industry, but it also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing sight of professional boundaries. In the face of external pressures, the airline had made its decision, and while the public had moved on, the echoes of the story continued to resonate in the conversations about how to build a healthier and more supportive work environment for the people who kept the industry running.